I'm Reverend Phil, and I'm your host for Words of the Prophets. Where are our prophets now? Where are those messengers God chooses to communicate divine revelation through? In the past, the Creator sent prophets like Abraham, Siddhartha, Jesus, Muhammad, and many more. Maybe our higher power has switched tactics since we reinterpret God's words as soon as the Creator's prophets leave us. Could it be that Spirit talks to each one of us individually and we haven't learned to listen? On Words of the Prophets, our modern prophets show us how to find the internal prophet that is the I Am, and we discuss the application of spiritual principles in all aspects of our lives.
Love and light, everybody. I'm Reverend Phil, and I'm your host for Words of the Prophets. Today, my guests are Brother Brian Dabowski, PhD, who's on the far right. Welcome.
Good to be here.
And I must do this for our good friend Bill. He said he wanted credit. He connected us again. So,
All
Bill
right.
O'Donnell, thank you. And on my immediate right is our good friend, Reverend Dr. Richard Murphy. Welcome.
Phil, it's good to be here.
Good to have both of you. Thank you for coming. Today's prophetic topic is a still small voice, and this is part 2. We started this last week. Part 1, we were looking at the books of the prophets from a Jewish perspective, and today we're going to be looking at them from a Christian perspective. So the topic for today is a still small voice, and this comes from the first book of Kings, chapter 19, verses 11 to 13. And reads as follows. And he said, Go forth and stand upon the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, a great and strong wind rent the mountains, and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire a still small voice. And it was so, when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle, and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice unto him, and it said, What doest thou here, Elijah? Now, I want to talk about that last question, too. Before we even do that, how about we introduce ourselves? I mean, just a little quick background. Brother, you want to go first?
Sure, yes. I'm Brother Brian Dabowski. I taught at the College of Santa Fe for 44 years, starting in 1965. And among the things I taught there was spirituality, religion courses for the summer. So I'm very happy to get into this aspect of it with Reverend Phil and
I'm the recently retired rector of St. Bede's Episcopal Church here in Santa Fe, where I had been there for 14 years, from 1997. And am interested in the subject of prophecy in the Old Testament, and have been working on a doctorate in theology.
Okay. Let's start with that. How about we define prophet and prophecy? And I know you emailed me that you had a particular comment you wanted to make. So you want to start?
Sure. Yes, see, what the prophets do is to stand in God's place. And they do that, as Father Richard Newhouse pointed out, that the thou of God became the I of Samuel. So as we reflect upon that, we see that the prophet becomes so intimate with God that he can speak God's word to the people. So he's a stand-in for God, he is a representative of God, and it's because he is so like God. So I wanted to point out that that's one of the things that really enlightened me in why the prophets are so interesting to everybody.
Do you want to add to that? Or?
I'd like to say ditto.
Okay.
But I would add too, as well, is that the prophets come along at particular crisis points in Israel's history. And you and the rabbis may have touched on that last week. But they come, as Brother Brian has said, as voices of God speaking to certain historical crises.
They come at crisis times. And I don't want to sound in any way disrespectful, but I mean, ancient Israel was always in crisis. Yet they stopped coming for extended period of time. Why? I mean, how do we view this?
Well, that is a serious crisis for the people of Israel. See, it gets started, as you'd find in 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 5. It gets started there with Samuel, who now becomes a transition from the judges to the prophets. Not that they'd been without, because Moses is the greatest of the prophets.
That's right.
You know, standing most like God, so in tune with God that he had to wear a veil lest the Shekinah blind the people. So there is this sort of being with God, but then it's quite likely that the Jewish people rejected that intimacy and lost prophecy.
And the prophecy, I mean, I think one of the reasons I wanted to do these two shows separately, as opposed to bringing all four people together, is there was too much material, and it needed 2 hours. But all of that prophecy, we'll go through some of these books. A lot of it was really apocalyptic. A lot of it was, predictions of messiahs. If I just heard you correctly, that was time specific. Yet we roll into the four Gospels, and we look at backwards, and we're kind of like saying, okay, yeah, they were time specific, but now they're happening again. Can we delve into that a little bit?
I think what I'd like to say there is that with the New Testament along comes John the Baptist, who picks up from when the ancient prophecy had ended. He becomes now a new prophet, a new voice of God announcing Jesus. And there's a whole new historical event that he's here to bring to the fore. So he is picked up. And then don't forget, people first recognized Jesus as prophet before they did as Messiah.
Mm-hmm. Right, and there's a sense in which he completes the process.
Yes. Yeah.
If the process was crisis specific, how does the process get extended for 3, 4, depending on which prophet you go to, 700, 800 years? How does that happen?
Well, see, if I had been there during the time,
Okay.
right, I could give you first-hand information. But I have to make a guess.
Okay.
And the guess is that if I had been there, I would have rejected the prophets. Remember in the New Testament, they say we killed the prophets and only later honored them. See, it's the fathers who killed them, it's the sons who built their monuments. Well, I probably would have been in the killing generation, because they were telling me things I didn't want to hear. See, the prophets were telling me I had to straighten out my life. And that's the way to get over the crisis. It worked rather well whenever the whole people began to move in God's direction. And when that happened, then the prophet began to get some traction, and there were good results. But people rejected the prophets. They killed them. And I think if I had been there, I would have been angry with them and would have wanted to kill them. So what I need is for God himself to take on sin, cure it, as Jesus did, like Father was mentioning earlier. And in this way, Jesus is God. He is more close to God than any prophet had been before, and he sort of finishes prophecy with his redemption of the people.
I think one thing that I'd just like to pick up on that too, it's important to remember that prophets were people of fear. I agree with Brother Brian. I would probably have some trouble. For instance, you're talking about Elijah. When he comes to the widow's house, she's afraid because she knows that the prophet can look into her deepest heart, her deepest thoughts. And she wants to back off until her son is brought back from the death. With Jeremiah, he actually tells the king, don't go out to battle, but surrender to the Chaldeans and you'll live. People didn't want to hear this. They just wanted to say, let's go out, let's do what we have to do militarily. In reference to your other question was, how does it carry forth? From my perspective, let's say, when Isaiah begins to talk about the wonder counselor, the Prince of Peace, that he's speaking to, depending on which Isaiah you're reading, because there's three of them, but he's speaking to an Israel in exile, and he's talking perhaps about a liberator. But when the evangelists begin writing down the life of Jesus, they begin to recall Isaiah. They begin to recall others and say, you know, it's just as easy to think that he was speaking of Christ as well as he was of that historical moment.
Let's go to Elijah. At the end of that quote, what doest thou here, Elijah? What is that question asking?
Well, he's trying to find out if Elijah is going to do what God wants him to do. And if Elijah rises to the occasion, if he accepts the challenge, see, then he is going to become closer to God and he'll be able to speak for him.
How come Elijah doesn't have his own book? I mean, there's so much emphasis on him, but there's no book of Elijah. There's books of minor, major prophets, however we want to distinguish them.
Right.
Elijah doesn't have his own book yet. It's Elijah who we're talking about, when we're talking about Jesus and John the Baptist. Shed some light there anywhere?
It's not long afterwards. What does Elijah take? About 4 chapters, I think, altogether. And then he ascends. His scribe, Elisha, who follows him, just simply didn't write things down. I think is what he had was probably a bad note taker. But that's jokingly aside, is that I think the important thing that Elijah leaves with us, that we don't need a book that we get out of those chapters so clearly, is exactly what Brother had said. Here he is sitting on the mountain. There's a mood of self-pity that he knows he's destroyed some false prophets. He's taken on the king. He's taken on the queen. And he's sitting on the side of this mountain and saying, oh, poor me. Woe is me. I'm the last one left. And God just breaks in the silence and said, you just trust me. And you just do what I tell you to do. And that's precisely what happens.
Yeah, see, it illustrates that even the prophets weren't all that close to God. We have this trouble of acknowledging the immensity of God, His infinity.
Exactly.
And I just don't want anybody to cast shadows on my greatness,
right.
You see. So all of the prophets had to make that adjustment. They had to continually recognize, well, Lord, it's you who is important. I'm your messenger.
Let's talk about prophecy for a second. I was watching TV the other night, and I don't think they ever gave this guy's name, but they're directing you to this website. This guy has predicted financial disasters and this, that, and the other thing, and he's predicting a major event in the upcoming months. They doesn't say what it is. What distinguishes... if he were to come out and say, this is God talking to me, how do we distinguish between a false prophet and a real prophet? Because we're talking about this corrective mechanism. So, can a prophet just, well, it was going to happen, but somebody did this and now it's happening this way? How do we distinguish? Why should we even believe these guys in the first place?
Well, because they call us to the life we really want. See, we want to be one with God. This is the deepest dynamic in every human being. It's just, it drives people. You've heard that famous expression, the guy who goes to the bar is really looking for God. So we look for him in the wrong places, but it's what we're really after. And since the people are really after it, they will eventually distinguish the true from the false prophet. In the case of the prophet who said that we're going to be taken away to Babylon, when they actually were, then the people who really want to get to God would be able to say, oh, he was right. And the majority of the prophets who were against him and who broke the yoke, a very dramatic thing that got everybody's attention, well, they were wrong, because here we are in Babylon.
Yeah, and I think the person you're talking about, who's forecasting disasters that we hear on the radio when something's going to happen, one way to distinguish is that he's not speaking. We all want some instant answers in our contemporary culture. We all want to know what's going to happen within the next 5 minutes. But he's not speaking to our deepest consciousness. He's not speaking to that deeper spirit in us. And that's what I think distinguishes him from the prophet. We can all, quite frankly, sit around today, and I think we could all agree and say, yeah, probably in some time there's going to be a terrorist attack. I mean, given the numbers and the odds and all that, that's no great prophecy. That's just a good guess. But I think it's those people that have been touched in such a way by God that they speak to a part of our hearts that, in reading in John's Gospel today in a daily office in the Episcopal Church, it's that moment with Jesus when he's speaking in the temple and he's not arrested, when the Pharisees asked the temple police, well, why didn't you arrest him? And they said, he's spoken like no other person has ever spoken. There's a chance that he could be the Messiah. It catches us at the right moment.
Sure. See, that's a great way to put it. When someone speaks to our spirit, they speak about our being one with God. They're talking about our ultimate destiny. Sure, we'd like to make some money, but that's for something else. And the something else ultimately is God. And when the prophet emphasizes that against the grain, see, that's what the Father was pointing out. If it's against what everybody else would like to do, if it's against the settling tendency, see, then is probably the real one. And we're able to see that difference. And if we don't see it at the time, we see it later when what the true prophet said happens.
We're walking down a path that I didn't know we were going to walk down, but I've got to ask this question. I've been on the air now close to 13 years, 10 on radio, 3 on television. I have used my airtime to promote what I would believe were spiritual causes. Repeal of the death penalty, that we shouldn't have a society that is homeless, or has people starving. And I really believe that that's against God's will for us. We're making parts greater than the whole. Does that make me a prophet? I mean, I'm trying to clarify, not just for me, but for people. I mean, because a lot of people get on TV and say things in God's name.
Yeah, we're part-time prophets. Right. Part-time minor prophets.
So is it supposed to be a full-time job?
Well, if we devote ourselves entirely to it, it would become a full-time job, and we wouldn't last very long.
See, I went around the past few weeks prophesying that the Patriots are going to win the Super Bowl. And I was proven wrong yesterday. I don't think that makes me a prophet. It makes me a person filled with hope and for a different ending. I think there is a prophet, absolutely, in all of us. And to me, always a modern example of that is Martin Luther King Jr. I think in the tradition of the Old Testament prophets that he fits the bill. He was a pastor that came along, actually called by a church because he would be a quiet scholar, and as opposed to the previous pastor who caused all sorts of trouble. And he came along, and then he was reluctantly dragged into the leadership position that he was, and became, I think, the great prophet that he was.
Okay. Would we then consider people like Gandhi, Bishop Tutu, prophets? I mean, I'm just, we have this word, we have this, it's very prevalent in today's society, so I'm just trying to help people narrow down what they are and who they are listening to.
Oh, definitely. Gandhi and Bishop Tutu were prophets because they presented God's point.
Exactly, yeah.
See, that was the way in which they were prophets. Now, there were other parts of their lives which weren't presenting God's point, but they did a lot better job than I've ever done. So it's wonderful to see them excel in as much as they did.
Okay, so let's look at some of these prophets, because I found these fascinating. My notes start with Isaiah, and I'm fascinated by through his writing, or the writings of the book of Isaiah. I mean, he starts off with what I believe is a call for practice over form. That don't do these sacrifices. Get out there and help some people. Maybe call it compassion a service. He immediately goes into his peace thing. Beat the swords into plowshares and that kind of stuff. Then he gets messianic, and then he gets apocalyptic. What is the message that carries forward with him?
First of all, there's probably 3 different Isaiahs.
Okay.
Some scholars will say 2, some will say 3. The first Isaiah, which is the first 39 chapters, is warning Israel of an oncoming exile. They've been unfaithful to God. They have broken the covenant. The second Isaiah was written perhaps 2 centuries later, if I'm not mistaken, who was speaking, and it was probably some sort of a student who had picked up the original Isaiah's writing, and he's speaking to Israel in exile. And he's saying, you will be returning, and there will be a peaceful moment, when he said you will be a light to the nations, when he talks about Jerusalem. And then that third Isaiah, which doesn't take place too much longer, is the liberation of Israel from exile. And some people will say, because it's so close, that there may be just the 2, but there's that third period when the joy is announced.
Well, those 4 things I mentioned all come within the first 27 chapters.
Mm-hmm.
He's warning Israel. He's saying, hard times are going to come because of your unfaithfulness.
So he's calling upon the people to get their act together. And at the same time, seems to be telling them, you're not going to get your act together. That we're going to have a king, and we're going to have this apocalyptic process because of that.
Right, because people do a lot of things. And some of them actually do repent, they drop their hypocrisy, but others are busy improving their hypocritical stance. See, they're becoming more and more tied into the jots and the tittles of things and paying no attention to the people. So you put it very well to say that, what God is calling people to do is a change down deep inside, where they really give up on promoting themselves and begin to serve others.
So would that be the complete overthrow of the earth, as it's kind of referred to?
Yeah.
That known world at the time, absolutely.
So we're not talking about a physical structure. We're talking about the people living, that the earth is the human experience as opposed to a ball floating around in the sky.
Right. But he's got to talk about something. And see, this is where the whole thing becomes poetry. Almost all of what we've got in the prophets is poetry. And we were unaware of that. When I first started studying this stuff, we didn't realize what it was like in the original language. And more people paying attention to that realized that, gee, this is poetry, which is a way to say the unsayable. It's a way to get across what cannot be stated. Like we can say, close the door and there's no room for ambiguity. But how are we going to say do what God wants done. See, this now requires symbols, it requires ways of putting together the sounds in patterns, where the patterns are closer to unity with God than the broken patterns. Some of that staccato stuff in the poetry is about, this is the way sin works. And it grinds on the ear of the people who heard it for the first time. So the poetry sort of tells the people how miserable they are in sin. And we can't say that very well in a sentence.
Martin Heidegger, the famous contemporary philosopher, he wrote the book Being in Time, and he had come along with his being the good philosophical egoist and saying, well, I can pick up where Aristotle left off, analyze being, analyze the essence of being, and so on and so forth. And all of a sudden he reached the same wall, and then what he does in his book and in his philosophy is turn to art, music, and he said, this is where you can find the spirit. This is where you can find the deepest meaning of being, and it's revealed in that non-language. Mm-hmm. And I think that's precisely what Isaiah.
So when Isaiah is calling for a monarchy coming from the house of David, we don't see this happening until we get to the point where Jesus appears on the scene. Mm-hmm. So the propheticness was really open-ended.
Right.
That's a good point, yeah.
And that's why some of the theologians say Isaiah didn't even know this, but God was speaking through him to give us our clearest picture of Jesus.
So then, taking that context, going back down to towards the end of Isaiah 1, let's call him, that concept of overthrowing the earth, is that then saying, okay, we know that the initial mission of Jesus is not going to make it, and is this also now part of the foundation of the book of Revelation?
And yet, the earth as we know it, the sinful condition, will be cured. That Jesus will take all of these sins upon himself and pay the price.
And yet here we are.
We continue to struggle, yeah. But the nice thing is that the ultimate victory is already won. See, Jesus did it. Now, am I going to second the motion or not?
So you get to choose your demonstration, so to speak.
Right.
Let me back this up for a second. So, where is the prediction that Elijah will precede the next prophet come from?
You mean Elijah will precede Elisha? In terms of I'm not sure if it's in terms of prediction, but like with Elijah, God says to Elijah, essentially, your time is up. You will ascend, the chariot will go into the sky, and Elisha will pick up your mantle. So it's God who chooses the time and the place and the how.
So then the statement, and I don't remember chapter and verse, so I'll probably, but at one point, Jesus says, well, he's here, you just didn't recognize him. Are we talking about a fulfilling of a prophecy? Are we talking about an acknowledgement of reincarnation? How do we view that in the context of the prophets and in the context of Jesus' story?
Well, it's a long, hard lesson to learn, but it's pretty much what Father was saying, is that this is the way God's going to do it, and he's in charge.
Yeah.
Now, that takes a little thinking about. I grew up in Texas where anybody who's in charge, it's going to be me. Well, this is not exactly God-oriented. And what we need to do is to switch that and to say, I can't compete with God. No, he is the one who has the power. He is almighty. And he is all-loving. and his plans will be better than my plans, like it or not.
Okay, so then we just accept what is.
I don't think it's a question of accepting as much, perhaps we can say a central message of the prophets is when they finally got in touch with their prophets. Trust God. Turn your life over to God's leading and God's word, and things will turn out better. Amos, for instance, speaking against the unjust ways that the poor were treated. If people had just listened and trusted and followed the way God wanted them to go, things would have changed. That becomes part of the problem. But I think, going back to the message of the prophets, it's that core call to trust God's leadership.
Okay, let me throw this out at the two of you. The prophets are saying we should trust God's leadership. Prophets are saying you're not doing it. So in some shape or form, God is going to punish you. The prophets are predicting apocalyptic, messianic, a lot of things. And sometimes they use as the base of it. Jesus comes along and turns that whole message around. So it's no longer we're going to get punished. You're loved. Doesn't that in some shape or form, does that negate the prophets or does it revise the prophets? How do the two of them come together?
You're loved by God in the Old Testament as well. Sometimes it's not too clear, but the love is there just as much as it is in the New Testament.
Well, I mean, the love is there because we're going to punish you, then we're going to bring you back into the fold.
It's always forgiveness. There's always forgiveness.
At the end. But there was always that punishment element. And then all of a sudden, Jesus comes along and there's no punishment element.
That's because he fulfilled the prophecies. He got it all done. You see, he who was infinite became a human like us. He took on a limit in order to pay the debt we couldn't. So one preacher put it very neatly. Jesus paid a debt he didn't owe because we owed a debt we couldn't pay. And once he paid it, see, then, like you're saying, it's a new ball game.
Yes.
See, everything changes with Jesus. That's why we mark time from him. This is the Anno Domini, 2012, right? This is the year of our Lord who changed the history because he took care of this backsliding, this continual story of cycling through. Well, we make some efforts and then we fall back. And he changed it. And now there are sins, but we can repent of them effectively because he paid the whole debt.
Okay, we're going to go off into an area that I'm going to do a show on about a month from now, which is the book of Revelation. Correct me if my timeline is wrong. We've got Paul's letters, which were, in terms of the Second Testament, the New Testament, were before the Gospels.
The first writings.
Yeah,
right.
first writings.
Yeah.
Then we got the Gospels that range anywhere from about 70 to about 100, 105. We got Revelation, comes about 110, if I understand. What would be the purpose of the book of Revelation if everything before that is talking about love, forgiveness, and the fulfillment? Why are we then getting a book of Revelation, again, coming back to a lot of it from these old prophets, predicting destruction?
Because the people were being destroyed. Because this is the persecution which is killing off all of the apostles and the followers of the apostles. See, Rome is destroying the leadership of the church. In the year 107, they even brought the bishop of Antioch, Ignatius, to throw him to the lions in Rome. So as the church is being destroyed, as the leadership goes down to the lions, you need to encourage the people. You need to tell them in symbolic form that right now it looks like evil is winning, but it won't succeed. We will survive this. We will thrive in spite of this. That's your basic apocalyptic message.
And see, I think that some people get caught up in what they see as the end times. They see as the great horrors and calamities that are read into Revelation. But for me, Revelation, again, going back to, like I said, at the core of the prophets is that call to trust. I think at the core of Revelation, which is oftentimes overlooked, is that John of Patmos, the author, opens up the glory of God, opens up the glory of what a heavenly vision might be like. And it's a deeply spiritual work on that level. I can get excited with some of it, and some of it is very confusing, obviously.
And some of it goes back to imagery, back into the prophets.
Right. See, that's all he's got to work with. He's got words which produce images, but what he's trying to tell us is that in spite of all of the dead followers of Christ, we are going toward glory. See? And this is the required encouragement.
So I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth. So are we saying that the book of Revelation is time specific then, not now?
Well, it was definitely time specific because at that time the persecution was so severe that people were on the verge of giving up. When you have that many people killed who were the leaders of this group, it's very hard to continue. However, it transcends time because God's glory is not dependent on anything, and we're always going to have our own little troubles. Right. You know, each of us is going to die, which is sort of like the end of the world for each individual. And we need this kind of encouragement. We need this view to glory.
I always like to tell the story that when I was in seminary, back in the 80s, Bishop Tutu was on the faculty. It was 1984. It was the year he won the Nobel Peace Prize. So the day the prize was announced, and you can imagine this is New York City, so I mean the auditorium just filled for the press conference with reporters. And if you want to talk about a prophetic vision, there was one reporter there, and I think it was one of the anchors at the time, kept badgering him and saying, won't you finally concede that your campaign to end apartheid is hopeless, that the government has the army, the government has the bomb? Can't you just accept the prize and go back to South Africa and say that the struggle is ended, that you can't do anything and apartheid is not going to end? And Bishop Tutu, just without batting an eyelash, looks at this reporter and says, I've read the book, we win in the end. You know, and then all of a sudden, you know, within years, down comes apartheid. That was an example of if apocalypse can mean revelation, which it does. That was a revelatory statement to make, because it's like Jeremiah saying this is going to happen when the king and the rest of them said, there's no way this is going to happen. And he spoke against the world. He spoke against the grain and said, we're going to win. I read the book. We triumph in the end.
So then the message becomes not apocalyptic, but basically persistence, keep up, you're going to... Yeah. Okay, I don't want to get too deep into this. I want to do that as a separate show. I got a couple other things I want to just touch on here. I mean, I've got so many... This has been such a fascinating endeavor for me. Daniel, chapter 7, verses 28 and 29. And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. And it goes on. What does the people of the saints of the Most High saying to us? How does that translate into current times, into Jesus' time?
I take it as... again, a pretty existential statement that God's kingdom is within us. I mean, from what it's been a long time since I have to confess that I've read Daniel or have preached on Daniel, but I think he's speaking of the kingdom within, and this was the great discovery that Luke made, I think it was in the gospel, where Jesus is announcing the arrival of the kingdom. I mean, that's sort of a prophetic statement right there.
Okay.
And see, the highest of the holy is God. And then there are people like Moses and Abraham and others who followed very close behind him, the saints. And we can join their number. See, we can be holy. It's our choice to do so. So, although we may not be up near the top, we can be in the group. And that's the kind of apocalyptic encouragement that is central.
So basically what we're being told in that verse is we can recognize the people who are demonstrating and following God's will, and we should be following them.
Mm-hmm.
Then he goes on. I mean, I don't want to keep reading here, but I mean, chapters 7 through 12, he has a lot of imagery that seems to repeat itself in the book of Revelation. I'm trying to put this in a simple form, but is, again, coming back to the Revelation, how much was there any writings or any further commentary by John as to influences of the other prophets that created some of this imagery that he put into the book of Revelation?
I have to defer because I'm not that much of a scholar. It's on Revelation is pretty technical and specific stuff so I depend on Brother Brian.
Put you on the
He knows everything.
No, not really, but I get enthusiastic about the little I know.
Yeah.
And what John does is different because the prophets were before Christ and John is after. So Jesus is revelation in the flesh, see, and having been there and having followed Jesus and listened and tried to puzzle out what he was saying and been with him at the Last Supper and been there when Jesus was dying on the cross and doing this redemptive salvific thing. See, having lived through all of that, now he is able to see that the prophets were talking about Jesus, and he is able to provide us with a new set. Now, there are parallels, and you can work those out. Those are great things for a doctoral dissertation in theology. To work
we're doing
out
that doctorate here. It's 57 minutes.
Right, yeah. And while all of that is happening, the main message is now that Jesus has done it. See, before Jesus, we were scratching around for, is there a way? After Jesus, there is a way. He is the way, the truth, the light. And that puts a different thrust to the entire writing of the New Testament. It's the other side of God's accomplishment.
In Mark's gospel, it's always an excellent example, which is the first gospel. Jesus will perform a miracle. He will heal. He will transform someone, and the blind, the lame, Simon's mother raises her up from a sick bed, and then he'll immediately turn to his disciples and say, "Don't tell anybody." Mm-hmm. Or he'll turn to the person he just healed. And we look at it through our contemporary eyes and say, well, that's crazy. I mean, they're going to go back into the village and people are going to see. What Jesus is saying, this is only going to make sense after I rise from the dead. And then Mark is looking back and displaying, so to speak, in a way, the apostles' awareness that, yes, all of a sudden we understand what he was talking about. And that's, I think, one issue of prophecy. The challenge comes in now that we have had the message. We're the audience. Another thing about Mark's gospel is that we can read it as if we're the audience watching the play and knowing the outcome. we can listen perhaps a little more closely, a little more discerningly to listen for the Spirit.
Okay. A couple other things in Daniel. One, there seems to be some prophecy that Daniel makes, again, kind of apocalyptic, that then later on gets referred to, my understanding is by Jesus, and it's about this, what's going to be the destruction of the Second Temple. Is this, are we carrying forward something, waiting for something to happen? I mean, I keep asking the same question. Sometimes these things, I find them so fascinating. I mean, are we waiting for it to happen, or are we saying, okay, it happened, now we're looking back? Let me clarify this. Nostradamus has all these, prophecies, and most of them don't make sense until after the fact. Is that what we're here? I mean, is that what Daniel's doing? Is that what is carried forward? Oh, yeah, that's what he meant.
Well, see, the first law of the successful prophet is if you say what, don't say when. And the second law is if you say when, don't say what.
Right.
And this is how Nostradamus intrigues us. He said a whole bunch of ambiguous things which we can interpret. And then later on somebody says, oh no, it really means this. And that's sort of a waste of time. But what the prophets of Israel are doing is they are telling us that there will be the destruction of the temple that Jesus tells us in the Gospels he's going to raise up in 3 days. And see, this is the glory that follows the cross. So now we sort of snap to it and we say, oh, that's what Daniel was talking about. The destruction of the temple is the death of the man God. And raising it up again is his resurrection 3 days later.
So that fulfills the statement that the kingdom of God is within. It's not about the structure, it's about the individual.
Oh, and also, one of the things to remember, too, that's important, and it's a lot of these books, including the Gospels, are coming to us years after the event, and these authors are reading back into, that's what he meant. Whereas at the time it may not have been as clear, but when it gets written down later, we're looking back at the life of Jesus 70 years later, it's got a different shape to it.
Okay, so that would also then refer to Daniel, according to my little bit of research, was the first prophet to actually talk anything about the resurrection of the dead. So this again is something said that we're waiting to happen. So there is, I mean, the more I'm hearing this, the more I'm like, part of the prophet's messages were that right here, right now, something's happening, but part of it was also beyond this time. And that we're just waiting for that time to come. And now we've got a whole bunch of people thinking they're prophets who are predicting what time that is. Interesting. I want to take a quick time out from the discussion, make a couple of announcements. Do either one of you gentlemen have any announcements you want to make?
None for me, thank you.
None for me.
Isn't it nice to
now that I'm retired, I don't have to advertise anything. Just
okay,
kick back. Rocking chair and newspapers.
Okay.
Ho, ho, ho.
I just want to let everybody know that you are watching public access television, and that means that you, the public, are part of this show. Love to hear from you, comments, questions. You can reach these gentlemen. Their contact information has been flashing on the screen. Mine flashes on the screen. It will run at the end of the show. So, love to hear from you. Maybe there's a show you'd like to do. Like to see a show that the topic you'd like to see me cover. Love to hear from you. I'll be happy to do so. We've had people on this show who saw it and said, hey, I want to be a guest on your show, and it's turned out to be fairly interesting. So, reach out if you feel like it, if you move to. Also wanted to let you all know that I am a spiritual counselor. I do counseling from a spiritual perspective. I don't believe that we can solve our problems with the same instrument that creates it, which is our best thinking, and that only with spirit do we really heal. I don't try to convert anybody. I'm not here to change what you believe or don't believe. I help you use what you believe to help you heal whatever the problems are that are affecting your life. I also work on a donation basis, so if money's an issue, it's not an issue. Next week is going to be kind of Valentine's Day week, so we're going to do a show with our good friend Reverend Batchelor from Unity, and the topic is going to be what else? Love. So tune in and find out more about what love is. Okay, so much for announcements. I want to, again, this concept of, future prophetic gifts to all God's people and the safety of God's people. This is Joel, and I underlined what he was teaching. Are we growing with the coming of Jesus in the definition of what is or isn't God's people? Judaism kind of saw it as a very narrow, and I think it started to expand with what Jesus was teaching.
That's one of the things Rabbi Heschel said, is that what has happened with the Christians, although it's not all to the liking of the Jewish people, is that more people now believe in the one God. And this is marvelous, but it continues to adapt, since we limited people can't equal the infinite God.
I think one thing I would add to that too, in bringing up the prophets, that I meant to mention before, is that in terms of what you just said, the message of the prophets was universal, was to the whole world. If you read Amos and Micah, speaking to all the people beyond the nation of Israel. So their voice echoes to us today as much as it did to the people of Israel at that time, but that their message was to all the people of God.
Okay, there were places in there where, Israel's neighbors, you either leave us alone or else. Wasn't that really more specific?
I think from a human point of view, it probably was. But if we look at the universal message of the prophets, we have to go back and reread that in terms of building up a just community beyond the borders.
So it's about we're putting out a message, and the message continues to grow.
Absolutely.
And the borders continue to evaporate.
Mm-hmm.
So then,
Hopefully,
okay.
Hopefully, we're all the people of God. We're all God's children, and we just have to listen to the prophets and discern that.
So let's just, I'm not sure how much time we have left because I've been neglect. I usually keep my own time. Okay. So we've got all these prophets, and they've had all these predictions, apocalyptic, messianic and all that. So I think one of you gentlemen said that Jesus started off as a prophet.
Some people saw him first as a prophet. That those people confused in the temple. Some saw him as the Messiah, but those temple police at least said, nobody's ever spoken like this. They hadn't heard a prophetic voice in a long time, and now they're beginning to think.
Do we need to, Do we need an updating of that prophetic voice now, or just a redefinition of that voice? What do we need for now? I mean,
Yeah, well, we need to pay attention to the prophets of old and the prophets of now in order to be aligned more closely with God. See, this is the basic message of the prophet, is that you want to be with God. And I have to admit that that's my deepest desire. Now, I mess it up periodically, but then I have to start over again. And this is what prophecy really stands for, is that these people witness to us God's love and how much we should return that love.
and we return that love to God, to God's children, to both.
Both.
Oh, both,
Both.
yeah.
And
It's
the
a
God,
thing.
yeah, speak to God, speak to the holy within us. But we speak to God and we speak to each other.
Yeah, it's the famous double-barrel commandment of Christ. Yeah, love God and your labor.
Yeah, yeah.
So we're here to basically go back to, Isaiah 1. I don't care about your form so much. What do you do? Who are you really helping? Who are you serving?
Yeah.
So it's a message of compassion.
Yeah, our worship has to be augmented through our carrying out of God's will. That to isolate the worship in and of itself as an isolated experience is what God is saying so often in the don't do that. Show me your good work, show me your justice. But that's got to arise out of your worship.
So it's not about the burning of the incense. It's not about all the sacrifices of animals and whatever those equivalents are today.
That gives rise
It's about
to your
what
actions.
are you doing out there in the world.
Mm-hmm.
As a result of that.
Excellent.
Yeah.
We're almost out of time. Either one of you have a parting thought?
Well, I think that the prophets are very inspiring. And that's what you were talking about. Just reading through them, you say, wow, this is great. And if we follow them, then we can be close to God.
Right. And I would say simply to listen to their call to trust and to believe in God's leading. And second of all, to see their humanity just like ourselves. Isaiah, Amos, especially, I'm a dresser of sycamore trees, I'm not a prophet. Jeremiah, they all wanted to run away from it. And Jonah is a good example. But once they found out that they could trust God, they could go out and do what they did.
Brother, Father, I thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been a wonderful show.
Yeah, well, thank you for presenting it to
Right.
the people.
Right. Voices of the prophet.
Words of the prophets, yes. I want to thank you all for tuning in. So the message is, like it's always been, the divine is within. You got to be out there and demonstrate it. It ain't about your sacrifices. It ain't about the incense you burn. It ain't about the prayers you make. Are you out there walking the talk? There's too much going on in this community that needs that walk. It doesn't need that talk. Go help the homeless. Go help the needy. Go feed people who are starving. Do something. Until next week, blessings to you all. I'm Reverend Phil, and I've been your host for Words of the Prophets. Thank you for tuning in. Please join me again next week, same time, same channel, for more Words of the Prophets.